Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our White Oak webinar series today. Today, we are going to be focusing on insects and diseases of oak. And I'm excited that we've got two outstanding speakers to explore these topics with us today. Dr. Deb McCullough with MSU Department of Entomology and Forestry, and Dr. Isabel Monk with the U.S. Forest Service, State and Private Forestry out of Region 9 over in New Hampshire. This is the second in a series of 5 webinars focusing on white oak. You can see that last month we explored oak ecology and silviculture. And next month, we're going to be taking a look at markets and economics for oak in Michigan. And then in February, we're looking at ecological restoration of rare oak ecosystems. And then in March, we're going to wrap up the series with looking at managing white oak for birds and wildlife. This webinar series is part of a national white oak initiative. The White Oak Initiative was started by the American Forest Foundation with several other partners back in 2017, 5 years ago already. It's been funded primarily through landscape scale restoration grants from our friends at the USDA Forest Service, State and Private Forestry. And there's a lot of partners throughout the eastern and central United States. Other state agencies, universities, forest products industry, landowner associations, foresters, a wide group of partners are working together on this White Oak Initiative, where there's national trends where oak forests, our older, mature oak forests, are not successfully regenerating, and the younger white oaks are not being recruited into the sapling and pole timber size oaks. And there's a variety of reasons for that. We're going to explore some of those reasons throughout this series. But this National White Oak Initiative has partners throughout the eastern and central United States taking a look at some of these issues and exploring some potential solutions. Here in Michigan, we've got a small coalition of a dozen or so organizations that are very interested in white oak on both public and private lands. You can see here some of the partners that are working on the white oak issues in Michigan. We received a small $50,000 subaward from the American Forest Foundation, some of those U.S. Forest Service funds, and the National White Oak Initiative to explore some of these concepts here in Michigan. And I'm actually here on behalf of the Society of American Foresters. I can't recall if I actually introduced myself at the very beginning there, but I'm Mike Smoligan. I'm a forester with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. That's my day job, and wear a couple of other hats here in Michigan. One of the things I do with the Michigan Society of American Foresters is help plan meetings and programs. And so as the program chair, it's my pleasure to be working with Michigan Society of American Foresters to host this particular White Oak webinar series. And Michigan SAF is about 340, 350 foresters here in Michigan from all sectors of our profession. University, government, private sector, industry, consulting, nonprofits. We really try to help all kinds of foresters grow in their profession and grow in their service to society. Just a little perk for Michigan Society of American Foresters. I'm doing my best to order a couple dozen copies of the Managing Oak Forests in the Eastern United States. It's, I haven't got the book yet myself, but it's supposed to be an outstanding resource helping foresters and landowners improve management of oak forests. And so those members of the Michigan Society of American Foresters that participate in any of these 5 webinars are eligible to get a free copy of that book. Please shoot me an email, and when those books come in, I'll be sure to pass one on to you. Now, all foresters, whether they're members of Michigan Society of American Foresters or residing and working in another state, are eligible for 1.5 hours of continuing forestry education credits for each of these webinars. I will be downloading the Zoom attendance list and providing that to National Society of American Foresters. So if you're a forester looking for 1.5 CFEs, that will automatically happen as a result of this webinar. No need to contact me there. Those people that are not able to attend this webinar live this afternoon, we will have recordings of the webinars available at michigansaf.org. We're going to have all 5 webinars available for free on michigansaf.org. So if you have friends that are not able to participate in any of the live webinars, the first Wednesday of each month, we will have those webinar recordings available at Michigan SAF. Now, as a forester, I couldn't help myself. I had to put a little data here on the opening slides. A couple of weeks ago, Lester Graham from Michigan Radio called me up out of the blue after they saw a press release about this White Oak initiative. And quite frankly, I fumbled pretty badly on answering some really interesting questions from a reporter about why are we talking about White Oak in Michigan? He had never heard any problems or issues with White Oak. And so I wish I had taken a look at some of these data from the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis sooner, before a reporter called me up and asked me some good questions. But the basic issue here in Michigan, and my understanding is that in many other states here in the eastern U.S., is that we've got quite a large number of large mature oaks in our forests, and quite a few acres of oak forests. And even though those mature oaks are producing acorn crops every few years, they may be regenerating into a seedling, but they're not moving through that sapling and into the pole timber and the saw timber size stages of their life cycle very well. And I'm not exactly sure what all those bottlenecks are at that sapling stage, but those are some of the issues and questions that we're going to be exploring with the White Oak Initiative. And all of the text here on this particular slide are actually coming from Scott Pugh at the Forest Service with FIA from their Forests of Michigan 2019 report that is coming out soon. But you can see that our saplings are decreasing. We don't have as much fire in the landscape as before. And you can see that one sentence there that oaks have a number of health threats. And we're going to be exploring that today. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Deb McCullough. Deb is a professor at the MSU, Michigan State University, Department of Entomology and Forestry Department. And I promised that I was going to be introducing her as the goddess of entomology. And that is certainly a title that holds true here in Michigan. Those of us working in the woods and with landowners in Michigan really enjoy working with Deb. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to the goddess of entomology.
That's pretty funny, Mike. I think that Mike meant to say goddess, goddess with a small g. I'm not really sure about that whole part of it, but I am happy to be invited to talk with you a little bit. White oak, you know, who thinks about white oak? I don't think about white oak all that often. And I know, I hope that I know many of you that are actually in person and paying attention to this webinar. I'm going to bet that I had some of you in class at some point in time. So hopefully we'll cover some material that's kind of review for you. But the beautiful thing about white oak is that usually when I get asked to give a presentation or a webinar like this, it's because there's some god-awful, probably invasive pest that's just wiping out a particular tree. You know, we talk about EAB and ash trees. We talk about hemlock woolly adelgid and hemlock trees, even spotted lanternfly. It's going to be a big thing within a couple of years, and spew honeydew all over. And you look at white oak, and there is not a massive, terrible tree killing sort of insect pest that white oaks have to deal with. So we do have lots of insects that will feed on white oak, and some of them are more important than others. And I thought today what we'd do is just kind of sample a few of these species, and I divided them into groups, feeding groups, or entomologists will talk about feeding guilds. And I thought we'd go through them a little bit, just some examples together. And I thought maybe we could start with gall formers and more or less dispense with those. Interesting little insects, but maybe not all that important. And then we'll get into defoliators, because Lord knows oaks have lots of defoliating insects, things that feed on the foliage. Some sap feeders, not tremendously important, but things that you might see in the woods. And then we'll get down to borers, both two-line chestnut borer and the insects that bore into acorns, the weevils. So gall-forming insects, these are like nature's little wackadoodles. They're very interesting insects. They do very interesting things to plants. Rarely do they cause problems for the trees, though. Nearly all of the gall-forming insects that affect oaks are in a family of wasps, tiny little wasps in the family Cynipidae. And depending on what species it is, it might form a gall, a particular kind of gall on an oak leaf. Other species form different kinds of galls. Some species form galls on twigs. And the galls actually don't do much to the tree typically. What happens is the insect starts feeding. Sometimes it's triggered by the insect laying an egg, but usually it's a tiny, tiny little wasp larva that starts feeding. And it's actually the saliva of that insect that changes the DNA of the plant tissue and causes the plant to form this abnormal growth that surrounds an insect or sometimes multiple insects and protects them from all kinds of bad weather, desiccation, natural enemies, and so forth. And I put in some examples, things that I've seen recently around Michigan. Fuzzy oak galls, they're actually beautiful. They'll be on oak leaves. It's mostly on white oak. I think you can see them on red oak once in a while, but mostly white oak. They can be bright, almost neon orange during the summer. Jumping oak galls. I wasn't aware that we even had jumping oak gall in Michigan until I got some calls about it last summer. And these, again, tiny little galls, almost looks like a bad case of acne on the leaves. All of those little bumpy things are the galls. And what happens is the little spots where the galls are, that tissue is going to die. And in this case, the leaves will actually drop early in the summer. Well, weeks before they should. Oaks will tend to hang on to their leaves through the winter. Well, these leaves are going to be dropping in August. And it's called jumping oak galls because the tiny little wasp larvae is still inside the tiny gall when the leaves drop. And if you're there at the right time and it's a warm day, it's hard to imagine, but the leaves will actually kind of move around on the forest floor because of these larvae moving around inside the galls. It can look bad, if the leaves brown up, like you see that one picture, but it's going to come and go. You're not going to have any long-term issues with it. And then there's oak flake galls, kind of nasty looking. You get one sort of gall on the lower surface of the leaf. And then if you look at what that gall does on the upper surface of the leaf, it makes that kind of yicky yellow looking appearance you see in the bottom corner there. Twig galls as well. I don't know if any of you remember, I think it was 2021, this wool sower gall was actually pretty common in a lot of the forests around here. And you'd walk through the woods and you'd see these, sometimes they were bright pink. You'd see them on twigs, or you'd see the twig might have broken off and be laying on the ground. It's perfectly round and it's kind of fuzzy. And again, that's just a bizarre kind of plant tissue that formed around this particular sort of gall. I don't think it gets on much else other than white oaks. And then oak bullet gall is really common on swamp white oak, but supposedly Quercus alba is a primary host. Both white oak and bur oak can harbor these bullet galls, and they look kind of bad. But again, they really don't have much of an impact on the tree. So that's about all I want to say with regard to galls. Just appreciate them when you see them. It seems like some summers are good years for galls, and we have a big diverse variety of galls to look at and take pictures of and so forth. What I really want to talk about are defoliators, the insects that feed on white oak leaves, because there is an incredibly diverse array of insects that feed on oak leaves, including white oak leaves. And some of these species go through periodic cycles of outbreaks where they reach really high densities, and often these outbreaks occur over extensive areas, much of lower Michigan, for example, or at least northern lower Michigan. We have other defoliators. They may blow up in a woodlot or in the woodlots in one particular area, but they come, they go, and don't really have a major impact. And of course, if we're going to talk about defoliators of oaks, we got to start off with the granddaddy or the grandmama of the oak defoliators, and that's Limontria dispar, the insect formerly known as gypsy moth, and now I guess the name is going to be spongy moth moving forward. So this is an invasive insect. It is not native. It has been here for a long time, though. Came into Massachusetts in 1869, courtesy of this fellow here, E.L. Trouvelot, who had an idea that he could cross gypsy moth with silkworms. And silk moth at that time, it was a big deal. They harvested silk from silk moths, and there was a disease that was wiping out the silk moths that were used at many of these factories where they just had big fat caterpillars and they were harvesting the silk from the big fat caterpillars. So Trouvelot goes back to his native France. Gypsy moth, spongy moth is native to Europe. He brings in some egg masses, starts rearing them in his bedroom in Medford, Massachusetts. Some escape out the bedroom window, become established in Massachusetts, and the rest is kind of history. In Michigan, we didn't have Lymantria dispar until the mid-1980s. The first outbreaks were in the Midland and Clare area. In the early and mid-90s, we had a big outbreak across much of lower Michigan. It would have been from about 1991 to 96, depending on where in lower Michigan you were. And of course, with Lymantria dispar, they go through 5 or 6, if they're females, 6 different stages, what we call instars. The really little larvae, right after they hatch out of eggs, they feed on oak leaves and they eat little holes in the leaves. And as the larvae grow, the caterpillars, they get bigger, their mandibles, their jaws get bigger, and they start being able to eat more and more of the leaf tissue. And of course, by the time they're in that last stage, either the 5th instar for males or the 6th instar for females, they can be 2 inches long, maybe even 3 inches long if it's a big, healthy female. And they can eat all of the oak leaf tissue other than maybe those main veins there. Then they pupate and you get the white female moths with the pretty white wings that don't function. And you get the little brown male moths that fly around and find the females to mate with. And white oak is very much a preferred host for this insect. A lot of people think that it is the most preferred host. So if you have white oaks in your stand, and if there is a gypsy moth outbreak, you will be experiencing that outbreak firsthand. James Weefrich has provided these nice maps. This is aerial mapping, aerial surveys for defoliation by Lymantria dispar. And our current outbreak got going in 2019. There was about 200,000 acres defoliated, mostly in northeastern lower Michigan and some in southwest lower Michigan. And then in 2020, it really started blowing up. You can see the red areas. That's what they mapped from the air. And keep in mind, if you're in an urban area, residential area, either a lot of those areas didn't get flown, or the defoliation doesn't really show up in the air just because you don't have the dense forest cover there. So lots of defoliation in 2020, 2021, the outbreak peaked, more than 2 million acres of defoliation. Much of lower Michigan had this insect going to town, including a lot of the area that didn't get mapped in the southern half of the lower peninsula. And then, as outbreaks do, the outbreak started collapsing this summer, down to 350,000 acres of defoliation. Maybe some more defoliation next year along the southern tier or 2 of counties. But basically, I think this outbreak is blessedly at an end. And what causes these outbreaks to collapse is really a pathogen. And the one that we count on is a nucleopolyhedrosis virus. Okay, it's a virus that only affects this particular species. It is always present in Lymantria dispar populations. You can have individuals that have a sublethal load of NPV, or if they get a big enough dose of the virus and the virus builds up in their bodies, they will die. And when you have lots and lots of caterpillars dying, like you see in the picture there that Bill Cook took, that's called an epizootic. And that's what happens typically after about maybe 2 years, but more commonly 3 years of high densities of gypsy moth. And if you think about it, these insects are like just about any other animal. The more of them that are packed into a given area, they start to become stressed. They're interacting and contacting each other more and more. And you see higher infection rates and higher mortality rates. And eventually that outbreak is going to collapse. There are other natural enemies that play a role as well. There is a fungus, the Entomophaga myrmiga fungus. Some years it's really good. It can cause a lot of big late stage caterpillars to die. Like you see in the picture, that tree was down in Allegan, and all those black things hanging off the tree, those are dead caterpillars killed by this fungus. But it's a fungus, and a lot depends on whether the temperature is just right in the spring to make the spores in the soil germinate and infect caterpillars. Not too warm, not too cold, not too dry, not too wet. So that one varies. We can't count on it like we can NPV, but it can, some years it's very helpful. And there's lots of other natural enemies, and as densities of the caterpillars increase, so will the mortality caused by these natural enemies. And altogether, what you look at is typically a 3, possibly a 4-year outbreak, but usually it's closer to 3 years. The other big one that we have in this region is forest tent caterpillar. And this is a native insect. It actually occurs across much of the US, and it's even found down in the South. It will feed on things like black gum and so forth in the South. But in the lake states, in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, you will find it feeding heavily on aspen, but also on oaks, white oak and red oak. And if there's northern hardwoods mixed in, things like sugar maple and basswood, these caterpillars will feed on that too. So when we talked about gypsy moth, the caterpillars hatch out of the eggs and start feeding typically in May, sometime between early and late May, depending on where you are in the state, maybe early June if you're up close to Escanaba and that ridge of oak up there. With forest tent caterpillar, they actually hatch earlier than gypsy moth. They will hatch and start feeding typically by mid to late April, or at least by mid-May. And like Lyman-Tria dispar, they'll feed for about 6 weeks. And the cool thing about forest tent caterpillar is that the outbreaks occur just about every 10 years or so. If we have more time, I'd give you a whole bunch of my thoughts about that. It's interesting that they tend to cycle somewhat with the grouse populations in this region. And if you know about grouse, you know that they also feed on the buds of aspen, particularly in the spring. But the outbreaks of forest tent caterpillar will persist for typically 3 to 4 years across a region. But if you look at an individual stand, usually there's only 1 or 2 years of pretty high defoliation in that stand. But when we have an outbreak, once in a while we have local outbreaks that are, just kind of pop up, but we tend to have these regional outbreaks about every 10 years across the lake states, often Ontario. Sometimes it even extends east into Quebec. You can see there the most recent years of outbreaks. And in the lake states alone, the 3 lake states, we can get 20 million acres of defoliation, which is pretty impressive. And again, much like the previous insect, these outbreaks collapse because of virus disease, another nuclear polyhedrosis disease that builds up when you have high densities of these caterpillars. You see this very distinctive liquefying sort of cadaver when you have an epizootic. And forest tent caterpillar also has a lot of native parasitoids. Okay, these are very specialized flies or wasps. In the case of forest tent caterpillar, the most important ones are flies. And if you look at that picture of the caterpillar, there's a little white egg near the head, and that is an egg that was laid by this tachinid fly that you see in the picture. That egg will hatch, and the maggot will feed inside the body of that caterpillar until it matures, and then it will pop out like you see there. That's a pupa of that parasitoid fly, and a new fly will come out and go look for another caterpillar to attack. If you live in the UP in particular, and you've been through an outbreak of forest tent caterpillar or two, you may be familiar with this pupal parasitoid that's called the friendly fly. It will actually lay eggs, and the immature fly, the maggot, will feed inside the cocoon that you see there on the pupae that's developing in there, which is good. It's very important parasitoid, but the adult flies like to lap up sweat, salty things. And so if you're in the woods when these friendly flies are active, they're going to be all over the back of your neck and probably driving you a little bit crazy. But they're a good thing, just got to put up with it. So those are two early season defoliators. There are also a whole group of what we call fall defoliators. And that refers specifically to insects that feed on oak leaves from about July all the way through August, sometimes into September. And the one that I see most often and get calls about and so forth is orange striped oakworm. Again, a native insect. Where I see high populations is usually like over by Ionia County, Montcalm County, Newaygo County, Kent County, and so forth. And it's a cool insect. It's a really pretty moth, and she becomes active in July, and she will lay eggs on the underside of oak leaves, and these little caterpillars will start feeding. They get bigger, they grow, and so forth. You get, when you have an outbreak, you have high densities of these. And like most of the other defoliators we're talking about, these outbreaks last about 3 years, and then they crash because there's a lot of native parasitoids that build up and go after these insects. Here's a couple more pictures. I got good pictures of this insect, so we'll spend a little time with it. You can see the eggs and the female laying the eggs there. You can see little larvae, bunches of little larvae feeding. Usually they're feeding on the underside of the leaves. They'll skeletonize the leaves typically and feed in between the veins. And they grow fast and they grow big. They will be as big as my little finger by the time they're ready to spin a cocoon and pupate. And big fat caterpillars make big fat particles of frass, okay, the little insect fecal pellets. People do not like that. They also will just really defoliate those trees. You can see a couple pictures there. All they're leaving behind is the big veins on the oak leaves. A couple other insects that are in this fall defoliator complex: red-humped oakworm and variable oak leaf caterpillar. Not nearly as common, similar kinds of life cycles. They stay in the soil until July when the adults come out, lay eggs, and then the caterpillars feed late in the summer. A number of other insects feed on oak foliage. You're welcome. We won't cover each and every one of them. Just a couple more examples. Oak leaf skeletonizer is common. You can often find this insect. You may not find the tiny little caterpillars themselves, but you will often see their pupal cases. They're about the size of a grain of rice, a big fat grain of rice. If you look at them closely, they have ridges running the long way. And when these insects finish their feeding and they go to spin these cocoons, they may spin the cocoons on the tree that they fed on. They may spin the cocoons on trees that they have no interest in. You can get high densities of these cocoons on windows and screen doors and so forth. That's probably as much of an annoyance as the defoliation is for the tree. They have 2 generations a year. Usually the first generation there's not a lot of density. The second generation later in the summer, you can actually see often some considerable defoliation. Doesn't tend to be very extensive. It's more patchy, but you get that skeletonized look to the leaf where all the little veins are left, but all the good stuff has been eaten by the insects. And then leaf miners. Oaks have a lot of leaf miners. The 2 most common are the solitary oak leaf miner and the gregarious oak leaf miner. Leaf miners feed on the good stuff, the parenchyma cells that are in between the upper and lower epidermis of the leaf, which is a great place to feed if you're a tiny little caterpillar, because predators are not going to be able to get at you. There are some parasitoids that will get these little caterpillars, but they can just feed away. They kill that tissue. They're eating the chlorophyll, so those patches turn brown. They're producing frass that kind of builds up behind them. And like the names imply, if you have gregarious oak leaf miner, you're going to have bigger patches of dead tissue than with the solitary leaf miners. I wanted to point this out and include this because I get fooled sometimes. I look at white oak leaves, say June-ish, mid-June, somewhere around in there. And sometimes these leaf miners look a lot like oak anthracnose. And I think Isabel's going to talk about that in a little bit. So, you look at these leaf miners, look at the blotches, there's going to be frass, there's going to be some kind of hole where the moth eventually came out from that patch. And that might help you keep it straight from oak anthracnose. I thought I should talk a little bit about sap feeders. Leucanium scale can be common on oaks. It's more common on maples, but you can certainly get it on white oak and red oak. And these are immobile little insects. They suck sap out of the twigs. They produce huge amounts of honeydew. That's just nothing but the sugar water that's left in the sap after the insects pull all the nutrients out of that sap. And so the sticky honeydew can fall onto the tree. Black sooty mold grows on the sticky honeydew, and you can really get a mess. If you have black sooty mold on leaves, that's going to reduce the ability of those leaves to do any kind of photosynthesis. This is mostly an urban problem. You don't see it very often in the forest because lots of natural enemies will go after these big, fat, immobile Leucanium scales. Where I have seen it most often, especially at very high densities, is when someone has used insecticides and put a spray on to kill some other kind of insect. And if you kill off the natural enemies, then you can end up with some high populations of these scales. Again, not a big impact for the tree typically, but if you're the one living and parking underneath that tree, you're going to notice it. And then this is the last one I put in, oak lacebug. They're just bizarre little insects. They're really flat. The adults have these very fancy wings. They're not very big. You have to look closely to see them. The little nymphs are kind of spiky and pokey. They feed on the underside of oak leaves, more commonly on white oak than red oak. They're sucking sap out of the foliage. You get this kind of stippling, we call it, this little, where every place they poke into the leaf, you get a little spot of dead yellow necrotic tissue. And then go through lots of generations in the summer. And typically, you don't even notice this until late in the summer when a lot of feeding has occurred. And the worst thing that can happen sometimes is the leaves, obviously they can look bad, and sometimes they will drop early. So that's just kind of a little run through different sorts of sap feeding insects and defoliating insects. And really, it's cool to identify what's out there that can tell you a lot about how long they're going to keep feeding and so forth. But the impacts of defoliation on hardwood trees really depends on 3 different factors. And one of the really important ones is timing. When is the tree being defoliated? And if it is early in the season, what we define as early in the season is going to be April, May, and June. That is much more damaging in terms of the tree's health and the physiological impacts of that defoliation than late season defoliation that will occur in July, August, maybe early September. When you think about it, the trees put a lot of resources, their carbohydrates, their nutrients, all of that goes up into the buds in the spring. And so when they lose those leaves, when they're very young, and those leaves haven't done much, if any, photosynthesis, that's a big loss. That's a net loss. That's like going to the bank and losing all your money before you ever got to the bank. In contrast, late season defoliation later in the summer, trees are already getting ready for dormancy. If it gets dry and kind of droughty in August, for example, being defoliated is not a terrible thing. That increases the root to shoot ratio and might even be somewhat helpful for the tree. And timing, so early season defoliation, that's going to be the one that is important to the tree. And then you have to look at the severity, how much leaf area has been removed from the tree. And really, hardwood trees, you know, your reasonably healthy hardwood tree on a reasonably good site, they can lose 30, maybe 35% of their leaf area. We call that light defoliation, and there is not much of an impact, not anything that we can detect typically. Doesn't really affect radial growth, doesn't really affect tree vigor. If they lose somewhere between 30 and 35% up to about 60 or 65%, well, yeah, now you've impacted leaf area. Photosynthesis is down. Some of it's still occurring, but it's down. Growth, any kind of height growth is going to drop. There won't be much, if any, radial growth. In other words, the trees are not going to put on much in the way of late wood in particular, and this may affect early wood as well. And then if a tree loses 60 to 65% of its foliage or more, you know, hardwood trees can be 100% defoliated and still survive. But that is very much of a stress for them. They're not going to grow at all. And typically that's what triggers the trees to reflush. And reflushing is what we call it when the trees have to put a second set of buds out because they lost the first set of leaves early in the season. And to do that, they tap into the carbohydrates and the energy that they have stored in the wood and down in the roots. They're able to produce that second set of buds. Those new leaves are going to be a little smaller. They have less chlorophyll. They're not as photosynthetically active, but they will photosynthesize through the summer, and they will make enough energy for the tree to get through the winter and be able to put those buds out again next spring. Now, if defoliation occurs later in the summer, if you don't get real severe defoliation until, say, mid-July, trees are not going to waste all that effort and all that energy to produce a second set of buds. Reflushing is something that happens with severe early season defoliation. And the duration of defoliation, obviously, that's going to play a role. 1 year of severe defoliation is not that big a deal. 2 consecutive years is going to be a bigger deal. Most trees, though, that are reasonably healthy can reflush for 3 consecutive years and maybe more. And of course, with hardwoods, you get those buds produced, and radial growth rates can recover relatively quickly once that defoliation subsides. And the nice thing is that even those big scale defoliators, Limontria dispar, forest tent caterpillar, and so forth, those outbreaks typically collapse after 2, maybe 3 years of heavy defoliation. And so that kind of interacts with the tree physiology, and the trees, they get dinged, they get stressed, but they keep going. Now, where we can have some problems is if you have trees that are affected by more than one stress in a single growing season. We've seen examples. I know there's been late spring frost that killed all the buds, and then the trees reflushed, and then Limontria dispar or some other defoliator hit them in June. You can have, I remember down Allegan, Ottawa County, during one of the big outbreaks of Limontria dispar, heavy defoliation. Early in the season, the trees reflushed, and then orange striped oakworm came in and fed on those new leaves. And that was kind of a double whammy for a lot of trees. Early season defoliation combined with a severe summer drought, that can be a problem. Not much you can do to control these big defoliators, and there's certainly not anything you can do to control a summer drought. But what we can control has to do with early season defoliation, and then we as foresters go into a stand and perhaps make things worse. And if you do some TSI or any kind of a partial harvest the fall or the winter following a severe defoliation event, what you are effectively doing is increasing evapotranspiration that those trees are going to experience next year. More sun, more wind, that's another form of stress for the trees that you leave behind. And of course, those trees will benefit eventually. It takes them about a year to reallocate some carbon, produce more roots and so forth, and they will do great after you've done that TSI. But you really, if at all possible, try not to go into a stand, open it up, regardless of what you're doing, when you have trees that have just previously been stressed because of early season defoliation. And the reason you want to stay away from that really severe kinds of stress on your oak trees, whether it's white oak or red oak, is because of this little fellow, two-line chestnut borer. This again is a native insect. It only is going to colonize stressed oaks. Usually we find it on red oaks, but if you have a stressed white oak, it will certainly come and attack that tree as well. It's a relative of emerald ash borer, doesn't have near the reproductive capacity that emerald ash borer does, but the biology and life cycle is very similar. Those female beetles are only attracted to the stressed related volatiles that are produced by trees. So stressed oaks, for example, produce a lot of ethanol, and there's some other compounds, and that's what the females use to find the trees to lay their eggs on during the summer. And this is what the larvae look like. The larvae, of course, at the damaging stage, they feed under the bark on phloem, that inner bark. They'll start feeding somewhere typically in July and feed through August and into September. And when it gets cold, then they, much like emerald ash borer, they'll wait out the winter just beneath the surface of that sapwood. And what happens is these galleries will score They obviously girdle the phloem, so that prevents nutrients from moving from the leaves down to the roots. And then their feeding also scores that outer sapwood, and white oaks are ring porous, so they need that outer ring of sapwood to carry water from the roots up to the top of the tree. And so you can get, usually the upper branches are colonized first. They're going to be girdled. So it kind of works its way down. It goes faster in red oak, but even with red oak, it typically takes a number of years before a full tree is killed. I will say too that if you have this kind of situation where you have some stress, you have two-line chestnut borer girdling and killing some branches, those trees tend to be more vulnerable to other secondary pests like armillaria that Isabel will probably talk about. Trying to identify all these different problems that affect stressed oak trees. There's oak decline, obviously oak wilt. With two-line chestnut borer, if you have trees that have been girdled or big branches that have been girdled, they hang on to their leaves well into the winter, just like a good oak should. You will find these larval galleries under the bark on the dead branches or trees. And like I said, this is not a fast process. This is something that's a slow kind of progressive dieback. And the way to get around this is to do good silviculture. Maintain appropriate basal areas. Don't do TSI if you've already got trees that have been stressed by defoliation or maybe a severe summer drought. Don't wound the trees, don't compact the soil, all that kind of stuff. The other thing I thought I'd point out is that when trees die from two-line chestnut borer, and again, it's not that common on white oak, but it happens, they're not going to produce stump sprouts. So now you've lost the source of your regeneration there. Urban trees, you have more options there. Again, you want to keep the trees as healthy as possible, give them every chance in the world to stay healthy. If you have limbs that are killed by two-line chestnut borer during the summer, make sure you know which limbs those are, because you will want to prune those limbs off and then chip or burn them during the winter. That will kill all the larvae that are overwintering inside those limbs, so you don't have a bunch of adults coming out next summer to attack that same tree, and you don't have to worry about attracting the little picnic beetles that vector oak wilt. You can use systemic insecticides. The products that work to protect ash trees from EAB work really well to protect oak trees from two-line chestnut borer. And there are situations where a cover spray of BT to protect the foliage from caterpillars feeding on it, might be Lymantria dispar, might be forest tent caterpillar, might be some other type of early season defoliator. Every once in a while, that's not a bad idea, just to protect the urban trees, the residential trees from becoming stressed and possibly susceptible to two-line chestnut borer. Finally, just a little bit here, acorns and acorn weevils. Who doesn't love a weevil, right? So what these weevils do, you see the adult weevils there, you got to love weevils. They have that long snout, and out at the very end of that snout is where their mouth parts are. And they have those kind of elbowed antenna about halfway down. And the adult weevils will feed on acorns when they're still green and kind of tender during the summer. And a female pokes that long snout in there and feeds a little bit on the developing nut, but it's tiny amounts of feeding. It really doesn't cause damage. But once she has matured and she's mated, she will feed, she'll poke a hole, she'll feed, and then she turns around and uses the ovipositor on her rear end to lay an egg or 2 eggs, maybe even 3 eggs into the acorn. And then those eggs hatch and the little grubby larvae feed on the kernel of the acorn, typically killing the acorn and leaving lots of frass behind. And then they emerge out of the acorn and they leave those round holes that you see. They're real characteristic in a lot of acorns. The larvae will go into the soil and they stay down in that soil for typically a year to 2 years. Most of these insects have at least a 2-year life cycle. The density and the population dynamics of nut-feeding weevils are really difficult to predict. They're variable. We think that there are a lot of these, what we call acorn weevils, will feed on hickory nuts. They may feed on chestnuts. They kind of go back and forth depending on what's available. You would think that if you have a big mast year with lots of acorns, and then the next year you don't have very many acorns, you would expect to see lots of those acorns be weevilled, just because that was all that was available to the weevils laying eggs. But that's not always the case. And I think it has to do with their ability to feed on different kinds of nuts, and maybe the fact that oaks tend to also be in the same areas as hickories in a lot of places. You would also think that white oak acorns would be more vulnerable to acorn weevils than red oak acorns, because white oak acorns don't have tannins and those really bitter phenolics, because they germinate in the fall. They don't have to protect themselves for months and months and months, whereas red oak acorns are out there all through the winter, and they're not going to germinate until the following spring. And of course, they are loaded up with tannins. Anybody that goes deer hunting is probably going to want to put a stand near a white oak as opposed to a red oak, because every deer and turkey in the land know to go feed on those white oak acorns because they're so much more pleasant. Where they have done studies in stands that have a mix of red and white oak, you don't find consistent evidence that the white oak acorns are colonized more often or at higher proportions than the red oaks. So it seems that the tannins and these nasty compounds that are in the red oak acorns probably have a much bigger effect on squirrels and little rodents and maybe even larger seed predators than weevils. So as much as acorn weevils can gross people out, and as often as you can find acorns with holes in them, it's not a good thing for oak regeneration, but there's really no strong evidence that these weevils are limiting white oak regeneration. And so just to kind of wrap things up here, from a forest entomology perspective, white oak should not be limited by forest insects. There are lots of insects that feed on white oaks, gall makers, sap feeders, lots and lots of defoliators, but none of these really are severe or tree killing kinds of pests. And I think, in my mind, white oak is one of those species where if we practice good silviculture and we manage stands appropriately, yeah, the trees are going to get defoliated periodically. They might have sap feeding insects or gall makers or so forth, but they're going to be able to tolerate that feeding and recover from defoliation or whatever these stresses are. Urban trees, people don't really like to see insects on their tree. The tolerance for insect damage is going to be lower. There's lots of options there to deal with insects on urban trees, urban white oaks. And again, it's just a really nice tree. I would love to see more white oaks around. Gosh, I'd probably run out of things to do if there was a lot more white oaks. So that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
Deb, thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions already in the question and answer area. The first question is regarding the NPV virus that you mentioned, limiting spongy moth. Has anyone used NPV as a pesticide application?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is absolutely yes, except that it's really difficult. So you can produce that NPV, the virus, and you can spray that virus in an area. And obviously, if the caterpillars feed on the leaves that have been sprayed, they're going to get a big dose of virus and almost assuredly die. The problem is that there's no easy way to produce the virus. You actually have to rear lots of caterpillars, infect them with the virus, harvest the virus, get it into a formulation so that the virus particles stay alive and you can still actually spray it and apply it onto the trees. And the Forest Service will produce NPV most years, especially if they know we're in the midst of an outbreak in some particular region. But they limit the use of NPV to places, for example, where you have an endangered butterfly. I know in Michigan we've used it, not we, but it has been used in areas where endangered Karner blue butterflies were feeding in oak savannas, and there was a whole lot of spongy moth around, and it was affecting the nurseries in that area and their ability to ship stock and so forth. And that's the kind of situation where the very limited amounts of NPV typically get used.
Excellent. That's really interesting. So it's not really commercially available, but it is possible for, large agencies like the Forest Service to produce it then.
Yeah, exactly. If it was commercially available, that would really be something, wouldn't it? If, we do a lot of BT spraying, not nearly as much now as in the 90s, but it would, if you knew that you weren't going to harm non-target species of moths and butterflies, we might be doing a lot more NPV applications than what we will typically do.
Yeah, interesting. Another question here related to spongy moth and forests that are stressed from spongy moth. Does fertilization with Milorganite or other types of fertilizers help to reduce stress in a stand of oaks that are stressed from insect outbreaks?
It can. I'm not familiar with that particular fertilizer, but you have to be careful with that. If you put the fertilizer on too late in the season, let's say you're concerned about your trees because they've been heavily defoliated, and you put some fertilizer on in June, late June, that can actually interfere with the ability of the tree to go dormant. It may extend cause them to go dormant later, which can be a bad thing if they reflush and then end up getting hit by a late frost like that. But the following spring, if you can afford to put some fertilizer out, particularly fertilizer with potassium in it, because potassium tends to stimulate fine root growth. And obviously having plenty of roots there to take up water when it starts to get dry, that's going to be a big thing for the tree in terms of keeping it healthy and helping it recover from that defoliation.
Great. Thanks, Deb. I've got two more questions for you here. How about, are any of these insect pests preferential for younger trees versus mature trees?
Well, that's a really good question. My answer is I'm sure there are some that preferentially feed on younger trees, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. Older trees, if it's an insect like spongy moth that's going to lay egg masses, they like that rough, thick bark that you find on older trees, so that you tend to get more egg masses, which means more caterpillars on them. A lot of foliage feeding insects like to be in the sun, and so they will tend to go up on trees. If you have a young tree that's somewhat shaded by larger trees or adjacent trees, they may try to move over to a tree and get more fully in the sun. Young oak trees tend to have higher levels of defensive chemicals compared with older trees often. So more phenolics, more the compounds that are hard for insects to digest typically. So that's a great question. Well, I'm sure there must be some. I just can't pull one out of my ear right now.
Okay, great. Well, Deb, there's a couple more interesting questions in here that I'd love to discuss right now, but I think we need to move over to Isabel's presentation. If you are able to see those questions in the Q&A, once you're done presenting, maybe you could type in an answer if possible. If not, time permitting, we'll return to some of those questions. There's some great questions coming in. Deb, thank you very much, but we're going to transition now to Dr. Isabel Monk, plant pathologist with the U.S. Forest Service, State and Private Forestry with Region 9 over there in Durham, New Hampshire. And Isabel, we can see your presentation, and you're all
Great.
set and ready to go. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Deb, for starting us today. There's my name and contact information, and let's see. So, as Mike said in the introduction, and I don't know if you listened to last week's webinar, but the main problem with white oak, also kind of following what Deb said, is not related to diseases of oak. It's oak recruitment and regeneration, and that's mostly because of shading, competition, silviculture, land use history, predation, and so forth. There are many oak diseases, but none of them that are completely, for white oak, completely fatal. And there's nothing that's like a really bad invasive that's wiping out white oak, so that's good news. So Also, because, last week, one of the speakers talked about planting oak seeds and trying to reestablish white oaks by planting. And so I wanted to have a slide in here about white oak diseases, but most of the work that I've seen relating to diseases of acorns is published in Europe and not in North America. And there's really no references for white oak seeds. But common post-harvest diseases are Alternaria, Fusarium, Penicillium, and Cladosporium. These are very common fungi that are in the air. They're usually associated with allergies, and they're very common, and they cause a lot of post-harvest diseases where they just kind of rot or decay the either like potatoes or acorns or whatever. So the picture on the right is a picture of an acorn that's been affected by one of these diseases. So if you're trying to plant oaks, you want to make sure you plant disease-free seed. And one way that you can kind of clear the seed of these diseases and these fungi is there's thermotherapy treatments. So basically you just heat the seed up, or there's hot water treatments where you can wash them with very hot water, and that will remove the fungi. Okay, so there are things that can affect the seed directly, and then there's other diseases that affect the seedling as it's developing. These are pre and post-emergence damping off. And anyone that's tried to start plants in their garage, like tomato plants, before planting, you is probably familiar with damping off diseases, because what happens is the seedling starts to come out of the soil, and then it just kind of droops. And these diseases are caused a lot of times by Pythium, which is a water mold. A lot of diseases of trees are caused by fungi, because fungi have chemicals that can degrade the really strong cell walls of plants. But water molds are not fungi. They're fungal-like, but they're not. And they're the things that, for example, accumulate in your shower and make your shower slimy if you don't clean it very often. So this slide shows a picture of different oak seeds that are germinating, and they have been affected by either Phytophthora or Pythium, which are both water molds, and you can see that radicle is dead. Now, this post-emergence and damping off fungi, they're more common in nursery settings than in natural environment. And natural environments might not have the moisture. They really like a lot of water, and so natural environments might be drier, and there might be other microorganisms that inhibit these damping off fungi or water molds. So they're much more problematic in nursery settings, and they're spread by water. So it's important to irrigate plants with pathogen-free water, and you can test the water to see if they're present in the water. And it's really important to control moisture by putting in tiles, try to make sure there's no standing water that's stagnating. You can also use pathogen suppressive container mixes, and you can cover soils with woven fabric or mulch to prevent splashing when the trees are being watered. And then in locations with much warmer weather than, for example, New Hampshire, where I live, you can do solarization of the soil. And basically what you just are using the energy from the sun to heat up the soil by, for example, putting black plastic on the soil, and that kind of cooks it and it kills damping off fungi. So Deb kind of went over, I guess, I don't know if I can generalize, but she went over guilds of insects. I'm kind of going by the plant parts. So I started with the acorn and the seedling, and now I'm going to cover root disease, and then I'll do stems and so forth. So root diseases and bud rots are the next section, and they can cause growth loss and mortality, and trees that are damaged in urban settings or high use areas can be a hazard if they fail and they hit a target. So the first one is Phytophthora cinnamoni. This is, again, a water mold. It's not a fungus. It was introduced probably from Southeast Asia. I think that's the origin of it. And it kills the feeder roots of trees. It causes root and bud rot, and sometimes it causes bleeding cankers. And water molds make a lot of different spore types. They make zoospores, for example, that can move in the water, and they are mobile, like little animals. And then they also produce oospores and chlamydiospores. And these fruiting structures are really sturdy. They have a really thick cell wall, and they allow the fungus or the water mold to survive in really harsh environmental conditions. So once you have a Phytophthora issue, it's very difficult to get rid of it. Phytophthora cinnamoni in particular has a worldwide distribution and many hosts, eucalyptus in Australia, and here in the US, it has been associated with dieback of white oak. It does require warm and wet soils for pathogenic activity. So I think for most of Michigan and definitely for New Hampshire, it's not an issue. It's a problem. It's a bigger problem in southern and mid-Atlantic states. I couldn't find a picture of Phytophthora cinnamoni causing bleeding cankers on a white oak, so this is the best I could find. But you can see that it's oozing. That's why it's called an oozing canker. If you peel back the bark, that's what you would see. And in the bottom left is a picture of the oospores, which are fruiting structures that are really hardy. All right, so moving on to fungi. So armillaria root disease, or also called shoestring root rot. Deb already mentioned this in conjunction with defoliators. Armillarias are ubiquitous. There's many species of armillaria. Some are aggressive primary pathogens, and some are secondary pathogens that attack trees are weakened by things like drought or defoliating insects like spongy moth, winter moth, brown-tailed moth. Drought is very often associated with armillaria or vice versa. And the problem is that stumps of infested trees can be inoculum sources for nearby trees. So that's something, and it's really hard to control. There's other root rots we have chemical treatments for, but we don't have anything for armillaria. Fortunately, in our part of the world, we have a lot of different types of tree species. So, high diversity of tree species makes it harder for it to kill large acres of forests like it does out west, because they have pretty much monocultures. It can cause growth reduction, and it causes white rot and dieback. And if the roots are really rotted, it can cause tree failure. We do risk tree assessments in our office, and tree and root issues are the hardest to diagnose because a tree can look pretty good. Like the tree that's on the picture, the crown looked good, but they can fail. And because they fail at the base, the target area they can damage is much larger. Signs of armillaria root rot are honey mushrooms, like the ones on the left. These are edible and allegedly bioluminescent, but I've never been able to see them glow in the dark. But allegedly you can see them grow in the dark. And also the reason it's called a shoestring fungus is because it creates this rhizomorphs, which are dark skeleton, melanin, like there are these structures that are like roots, but they're fungal and they're melanized, so they're really resistant to UV light and many other things, and they can subsist in the soil for a really long time. Another sign are the mycelial fans, as you can see on the right of this tree. This tree is a pine. I don't have pictures of armillaria and white oak, but it would look the same. You'll have a white mycelial fan, right around the collar of the tree. Okay. Berkeley's polypore. So this is a collar rot, and I've seen this a lot in urban trees. I've seen a lot in our town. This picture, actually, I took this picture in our town and also in like Boston, and it's very spectacular. It's huge, makes huge conchs. But the thing is that white oaks are very good at compartmentalizing decay. So they have really strong wood, and they're really good at growing, limiting the decay and growing around it. And so what I find interesting about this picture is that it has a really big fungus growing, the stump, but really the decayed area is not very big. So that's good news for homeowners that have white oaks on their properties. Okay. So that was root diseases and collar rods. Now I'm going to move on to vascular diseases. So these are diseases that are caused by a pathogen that moves systematically through the vessel cells. And because it does that, it causes wilt. It interferes with the tree's ability to pull water from the soil up to the leaves. And so the symptoms of this are usually parts of the crown that are wilted, or the entire crown. It looks like drought. Again, oops, hold on. So this, I think, I consider the most problematic disease of white oak. Not really because of white oak, because white oak is more tolerant than other species of oak, like the red oaks, but because it can harbor the disease. So it could interfere with, control strategies and management. So white oaks, the reason white oaks are good for barrels, in comparison to red oaks, if you had a barrel made out of red oak and you put water in it, it would leak out, and white oak doesn't do that. And that's because white oaks have a lot of tyloses. So tyloses are structures that are made by parenchyma cells, which are right next to the tracheae, the vessels that carry the water. And it's like a balloon, and they can plug up those water vessels. And that's why white oaks are much more tolerant to oak wilt, which is caused by Bretsella fagacearum, than the red oak species. And so this is a picture, or most of the pictures that I used, I just want to credit, were taken by either Joe O'Brien, Steve Katovich from the Forest Service, or Paul Botke. And so this is a cross section of a white oak that's infected with oak wilt, and you can see all the dark staining in the vascular system of this rather small tree. So the fungus is spread either by insects or root grafts, and it quickly spreads through the vascular system. Trees can die red oaks can die within 6 weeks. White oaks usually stay alive for years. But the fungus goes from the vascular system and it grows in dead trees right next to where the bark is, and then it creates the spore pads, which is what is the picture on the right. And these spore pads have a very sweet smelling scent. To me, it smells like cleaning products. And this, the scent of the fungus attracts nitidulids. So nitidulids are kind of like the luscious of the insect world. They like ethanol and they like sweet smelling things. They're called picnic beetles because they show up at picnics, when food and sweet smelling stuff is around. They're attracted to these spore pads made by the fungus, and they walk around in there and they get full of spores. And they're also attracted to wounds of oak trees. So if they're covered with spores and then they go to a wound, that's how trees get infected, and that's overland spread. Another way that trees get infected is, underground through root grafts. And so basically for oak wilt control, root rupture is really important. Oak wilt we don't think it's native. It was first discovered in Wisconsin in the 1940s, and it has been spreading slowly to all the way south to Texas, and I guess east to as far east as New York. In New York, it's spreading slowly. They're being really diligent about trying to stop it from getting into the New England states. And so, here's a picture of the tyloses this is a vessel the vessel on the left doesn't have tyloses and the water can freely go up and down. The one in the middle has some tyloses, and then the one on the right is totally blocked. But oak wilt management is very, I don't know what the word is. The good thing about oak wilt is that it can be managed, because if you can do root ruptures and so forth, and you can disrupt the roots and therefore stop it from spreading, or you can remove the stumps and so forth. But it's also, all this management is very invasive. So if you have oak wilt in an urban setting, it can be really upsetting to people. If their trees die on their property, or controlling them can be a big deal. It gets really expensive. All right. This is my favorite fungus that I'm going to be talking about today, the sulfur shelf or chicken of the woods fungus. It is edible. It's called Lidoporus sulphureus in Latin, and it is edible, but some people have reactions to it if they eat it with alcohol. And it causes a brown rot. So fungi can cause white rot or brown rot. White rotters decay both cellulose and lignin, whereas brown rotters decay cellulose and leave the lignin behind. But the brittle brown cubicle rot is more brittle than white rot, and these trees that have the sulfur shell fungus can be really prone to wind throw. So, in a forested setting, it's not a problem, but in an urban setting, it could be an indicator of a potential hazard. So these are stem decays. The chicken of the woods is an example of a stem decay. Another type of disease that affects stems are canker fungi. Canker fungi are not decayers. Decay organisms usually need a wound or a branch stub to get into the tree, and then they decay the heart rot. Whereas cankers usually live on the living part of the tree, on the phloem and the xylem. And in this case, spot canker I'm using the term widely, bot canker, because there's many species of Diplodia and Botryosphaeria that cause similar symptoms in oaks. And usually it's associated with drought or defoliation events or stress. These fungi can live in the host without producing any symptoms. And then there might be a stressor event where they're released, and then they start causing dieback of branches and browning of leaves. And you can see that it discolors the xylem. And a lot of times, what I haven't seen a lot of Diplodia and Botryosphaeria on white oak. I've seen it mostly on red oak, but it has been described on white oak. Okay, and then this is really not a problematic thing, the mace polypore, but I wanted to bring it up because I see it a lot in oaks and I get a lot of questions about it. The scientific name is Didalia quercina. Didalia, it refers to the Greek mythology, where I think someone called Daedalus created a mace to stop the Minotaur. And the underside of this fungus looks like a mace, and that's why it's called Didalia quercina. The reason the fungus does that is to increase the surface area where it can produce spores, but it's not, unlike the sulfur shell fungus that is an active disease that's affecting the living part of the tree. This is a sap rot. It is only present in parts of the tree that are already dead. So I wanted to point it out for anyone that might be an arborist. If you see mace polypores, that part of the tree is already dead. And if it's on a branch that's big, you want to be careful with those branches or that part of the stem. All right. So leaf diseases, this is almost my second to last category, are problematic because they reduce photosynthesis and they weaken the tree, but generally they're not lethal. And just like Deb was saying that early defoliators are much worse than late defoliators, the same is true for leaf diseases. Things are like anthracnose that affect trees when the leaves are developing in the spring are more problematic than mildews that develop later in the season. So the first one I wanted to mention was bacterial leaf scorch. We've been talking a lot about diseases caused by fungi. Bacterial leaf scorch is caused by bacteria, Xylella fastidiosa, and this is a problem. You know, Xylella fastidiosa is a very big problem in vineyards and many crops. It's spread by sharpshooters and leafhoppers, and it's not generally something that kills trees, but they can look really bad like this. And the leaves, like in oak wilt, the leaves look brown, but what's very telling of bacterial leaf scorch is this yellow area, chlorosis. There's like a chlorotic ring between the brown necrosis and the green healthy part of the leaf. So if you see browning and then surrounded by like a yellow halo, that's very diagnostic of bacterial leaf scorch. It's problematic in areas that have both oak wilt and bacterial leaf scorch because the symptoms are really similar, so it makes diagnosis difficult. And it's also problematic in like for city trees. Okay, Deb mentioned oak anthracnose in relation to leaf miner that looks similar. Oak anthracnose affects we get, you know, diagnostic clinics get a lot of calls about oak anthracnose. It can look really bad, but it's not lethal to the tree. What happens is during prolonged periods of wet weather, this fungus can proliferate. It overwinters and lives in the twigs and the bark, and also like in infected foliage that's on the ground. And it infects leaves right as they're emerging, you know, and when they don't have a strong waxy cuticle to protect them, that's when it makes the leaves, and first it makes the leaves turn what they say like a water spot, so almost like a transparent look, and then they turn gray and eventually brown like the ones in these pictures. But typically it's not something that will kill a tree. And it's episodic, you know, it doesn't occur every year. It occurs in years where there's continuous wet weather in early spring when the trees are leafing out. And control measures in landscape settings would be, you know, remove leaves from the soil and infected twigs and so forth. Sanitation. All right. So Tubacia leaf spot is a problem in, I think Indiana, it's the state that has most reports of Tubacia leaf spot. And it's a very cool looking fungus. You can see it on the right. And it causes leaf spot and blight. Again, it's not lethal, but it's problematic in areas where there's oak wilt because Tubacia and oak wilt look similar. So you don't want to make sure you have a correct diagnosis, since removing, you know, if the trees are infected with oak wilt, it might require removal and so forth. Diagnosing these things is really important. And then leaf blister, I put it in here because it's really common, but it's caused by a fungus. It makes the leaves look discolored and like bumpy, but it's not that bad for it. It's just more of a cosmetic thing. And then powdery mildew is really common in the fall. So because it's a fall disease, it's not very important. The leaves are completely covered with the mildew, and the mildews have these fruiting structures called cleistothecia, like the one on the bottom right. And you can identify what kind of with what kind of species it is based on the ornaments of the appendages. So here they're like very ornamented. But because the leaves are affected in the fall when the tree is mostly done with photosynthesis, it's not a big deal. And here's a picture of smooth patch. We get a lot of calls about smooth patch too. It's a disease that it's a fungus that eats the bark of the tree, and it likes white oaks and also white ashes because they have really corky bark, but it doesn't really do anything. It just kind of makes, exactly like the name implies, it makes a smooth patch, and it doesn't really affect the tree health at all, but people do notice it. And I was talking to some foresters who were concerned, not on white oak, but they were concerned about ash. And they were asking me how like smooth patch is different from blonding. So we had a discussion about that, which I thought was interesting. But usually you can see, in addition to the missing bark, you can see like white pieces of fungus. So that's also diagnostic. And then my last slide is about mistletoe, which is not a problem in the northern part of the country, but it is a problem for southern states. Although mistletoe is parasitic in the sense that it lives on the tree and it sucks water. It can make its own food through photosynthesis. So it's not usually something that will kill a tree. And for management recommendations in general, I'm just gonna repeat what Deb said. You want to keep trees healthy, practice good silviculture. In urban settings, you want to make sure you prune trees properly, you don't wound them. So, to avoid stem decay. And you want to water trees and mulch them properly so they're not water stressed. And in forest settings, you want to practice good silviculture, have, allow the trees to have adequate growing space. I think we've all learned from COVID that host density is a big problem in terms of disease management. It's the same for trees. You don't want the trees to be overcrowded. You want them to have appropriate spacing so they can grow and flourish. And here are some references in case you want to read more. With that, I'm going to stop share. That's the end of my talk. Mike, are you going to?
Yeah, Isabel, thank you very much. We haven't had anyone type a question in yet on pathology, so I'll give folks a minute or two to think up a question and type it in there. But I've got a question for you, similar to one of the questions for Deb. Are any of these diseases, or is a young oak tree more susceptible to any of these diseases, or are these really more diseases that are going to be targeting mature, older trees?
Sure. Yeah, the Phytophthora are problematic for younger plants because they kill the feeder roots, and they, when the seed sprouts and they're developing, they can kill the plant at that stage. Also, anthracnose can be worse for younger trees because they have less waxy leaves. They're just more vulnerable. They have less, waxy components for them. For trees, there's a big barrier against disease. So younger trees tend to have less waxy leaves and things like that. And so the leaf diseases tend to be worse on younger trees.
Great, thank you. And I guess another related question. So what I heard today from both you and Deb is that there are a large variety of insects and diseases that affect oak, white oak in particular, but none of them are really the problem that this White Oak Initiative is trying to solve with this, barriers to regeneration and saplings recruiting into the pole timber stages. It sounds like insects and diseases are not the primary cause of that, white oak general decline across the eastern U.S.
To be fair, I don't know if anyone's looked into it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that Isabel makes. As often as I can wander around in the woods and look at acorns, I see so many acorns that are weevilled, and it's kind of hard to believe that doesn't have some sort of an impact on what is available to germinate. Now, once they germinate, then I guess I'd be looking at deer and deer browse, for example. And I think there's a real role for prescribed fire too. But I think Isabel and I can be helpful, but the forest ecology and forest silviculture people may be more relevant in terms of why white oak regen seems to be having such a problem.
Great, thanks, Deb. We do have a couple more questions coming in, and Isabel, I see that you've already seen that and started typing a reply. Thank you. We've got a question regarding oak wilt, and is oak wilt being misdiagnosed, where instead of oak wilt, it might be a combination of defoliation, drought, or armillaria, or other things causing mortality rather than oak wilt itself?
I'm not sure if it's being misdiagnosed, but the symptoms are very similar. So I would definitely send samples to a clinic to make sure that you have the right thing, because if you're trying to control oak wilt, it's very aggressive. You have to remove all the trees around, and rupture the roots and so forth. But I'm not sure how often it's misdiagnosed.
Yeah.
And then the other,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Deb.
Sorry, Isabel, I didn't mean to cut in. So the MSU Plant and Plant Pest Diagnostic Clinic will run PCR and identify oak wilt if you can provide them a sample, and they're happy to tell you how to get a sample from an oak tree if an oak tree has died, to find out if it has oak wilt. If somebody is diagnosing oak wilt on the basis of external symptoms, then you have a problem, because I think there are a lot of these other issues that can sometimes mimic oak wilt. So I would not attempt to diagnose oak wilt without having it confirmed by a lab test. The other thing that happens is sometimes Lymantria dispar gets blamed for some oak mortality because everybody sees the big fat hairy caterpillars, when in fact it is exactly what Perry put down in the question there. It's a combination of, could be some forest tent caterpillar defoliation for a couple of years, and then a late spring frost, and maybe a cruddy sandy soil, and sometimes overaged trees. Northern pin oak is not a long-lived tree, and sometimes I think we tend to blame whatever pest is most uppermost in our mind. So yeah, if any suspect of oak wilt, get it confirmed by a lab for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Deb. We have another question here. Looks like Isabel is typing a reply, but let's address this verbally as well. It applies to both of you. How about climate change, and how will climate change impact these insects or diseases?
I can say, like, for example, drought predisposes trees to a lot of diseases like the Botryosphaera cankers and armillaria, and weakens them. But it's complicated because hotter conditions are also not great for fungi. They usually like 25 degrees Celsius. So they usually like the same weather you might like, 60 to 70 degrees, not too hot, not too cold. And, they like moisture. So it depends.
Yeah, that's a really complicated answer. Attempt to answer that question, like Isabel said, is very complicated. With insects, one of the things that worries me a little bit is we have always counted on cold winters, and maybe not every winter do we have some severe cold temperatures, but every 2-3 years or so, much of the state, especially northern lower Michigan and parts of the UP, we have a really cold couple of nights or so. And that can cause mortality for a variety of insects, depending on what life stage and what location they tend to overwinter in. And we know for sure that winters are getting shorter and warmer. And you kind of wonder, is there a possibility that some of the insects that are not that big of a deal right now could become more important in terms of pests, just because their densities are not knocked back when we have a really cold temperature. And then, much like Isabel said, any kind of drought, we don't have the snowpack that we did 20 years ago. You get a dry summer, stressed trees stressed by drought, they're also going to be more vulnerable to a lot of pests, especially those secondary kinds of pests. And I don't really see anything good about climate change. It's just hard to put a finger on exactly which insects and exactly what kind of problems we're going to have, by mid-century. It's not like it's far off. We're going to have very different temperatures and climate in much of Michigan by 2040. So it's something we're going to have to pay attention to.
Isabel, any final comments or
No,
Right.
only that pathogens and insects have short life, lifespan, so they can adapt quicker to climate changes than trees have really long life, so it's harder for trees to adapt.
Okay, just because I know we got like 30 seconds left, but that's something for forestry people to think about, depending on what kind of regeneration you're doing. If you're planting, doing any kind of planting or putting in seedlings or anything, talk to the people that work full time on climate change, because it may not, you may want to look at seed sources from lower latitudes, for example. All the models, all the climate models that are overlaid on top of tree distributions and forest cover type distribution show a shift of oak hickory moving to the north. And if you're getting ready to establish a stand or put something in after a harvest, might want to be thinking about what it's going to look like in 2050.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. There's a lot of good resources out there related to that. NIAX, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service and Michigan Tech and a wide variety of other partners. NIAX puts out some really good resources to help people evaluate their risks and their adaptive strategies related to climate change. So yeah, there's a lot going on between insects, diseases, silviculture, climate change. There's a lot of things we need to learn about the woods and a lot of good work to do out there. But looks like we've run our full 90 minutes this afternoon. Deb and Isabel, thank you very much for presenting and bringing these concepts to the group today. And I will be getting this recording available at michigansaf.org. And I'll be sending out the direct link to the recording to all the people that registered for this webinar, but were not able to attend. And for everyone else, we hope you will join us next month as we take a look at markets and economics of oak here in Michigan. Let me get out my slide here real quick. That looks to be on January 4 at 3 p.m. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Isabel.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.